Thank you for coming. So my name is Bob Budiansky, and I worked at Marvel Comics for from 1976 to 1996.
Hey, Transformer fans! This panel recording is sponsored by those flesh creatures over at 80stees.com, and they have the shirts that are definitely more than meets the eye. Use coupon code FSTRANSFORM for 30% off your next order at 80stees.com. And you won't wait an eternity for these. Now, on to the panel.
And in November of '83, Marvel was beginning to develop this new property for Hasbro toys known as Transformers. And just like Marvel had done a couple of years previously with G.I. Joe, Hasbro came to Marvel, made some kind of a deal. I certainly was not involved in that deal-making part of the process. Marvel provided the creative talent to develop G.I. Joe into a storyline with characters, etc. Larry Hama was the person behind that. He's here at the convention today. And then a couple years later, same thing happened. Hasbro acquired the rights to develop these Japanese toys and rebrand them as Transformers. I guess they came up with the name Transformers. And they came to Marvel and said, we want you to develop the storyline and the characters. And that is page 1 of the treatment, the backstory of the Transformers, which I did not write. That was written by Jim Shooter, who was editor-in-chief at the time at Marvel Comics. So what you're reading is the beginning of the mythology that was created around the Transformers, and it was originally created by Jim Shooter. Next. And then it continues, and you can scan through it and see next. And it's, about the Decepticons and the Autobots and the war and Cybertron, all the things you're very familiar with. Next. So now you see that there's a few changes in there. That is actually my handwriting. By this point, I was involved with helping Jim develop the Transformers. So you'll see, if you look close, like somewhere toward the middle, a little past the middle, the word "the Ark" is written in there. So originally, the spaceship that brought the initial Autobots and Decepticons to Earth, they crash-landed in Washington State on a spaceship, and it was called Anty, A-U-N-T-Y, which is crossed out, thankfully, and it was replaced by the words "the Ark." So that was the, one little edit that was done there. Next. And again, more of the treatment, and you can see the Ark is scribbled in on the very top. Again, the Anty was crossed out. Next. Come on. Okay, and then there's more changes. So you see that about a quarter of the way down, we're introducing the Wiki family in the treatment, and the word Spike is crossed out and Buster is put in instead. So apparently Hasbro had an issue with the word Spike for the name of the son, the Wiki son, so it was changed to Buster. This is all changes that were done by Jim Shooter that were dictated to me that I scribbled in there. Next. And then finally we get to some of the characters. So you see Optimus Prime and Prowl. Next. And then, okay, this is a little bit off the image, but at the very top, there's a word, the very first word there is Oktar, which is also crossed out. So that's another character that was developed, that was rejected. That became Starscream. Next. And here we have where I get involved, besides the scribbling. So, besides scribbling out the other words. So what happened was Jim Shooter did the treatment, which you just saw, and that was generally accepted with a few changes by Hasbro. And then Jim, being the editor-in-chief of Marvel, was a busy guy, and he wanted to hire somebody to develop the characters. So the original line of Transformers were 26 toys. So 26 characters needed to be developed. And the writer that he hired, who was a senior editor at Marvel, who had a lot of writing experience, for whatever reasons, Jim did not like most of the work that he turned in. Oktar being one of them, one of the pieces that he turned in. Didn't care for that name, I guess. So Optimus Prime and Prowl stuck. Those names carried over. But the other 24 out of 26 toys that had to be developed, still had to be named, and character profiles had to be written for all 26 of them. So at this point, this is November of 1983, Jim was getting kind of desperate. He didn't want to continue working with the editor that he hired, so he walked from editor's office to editor's office at Marvel, looking for somebody else who would take on the assignment. And just to give you a time frame, this was either on a Wednesday or a Thursday in November, and the following week was Thanksgiving. And this all had to be done by the Monday before Thanksgiving, all 26 of these characters. And people were making travel plans to go back home, and they had other jobs they were doing, and they were busy and all that. So Jim was sort of up against the wall. He went to Larry Hama, who had developed G.I. Joe, and Larry said no. He went to a couple other editors who had writing experience. They said no. He finally got to me. So I was like, the fourth or fifth choice. And I was mostly known as an editor who drew, not an editor who wrote. I didn't have any real writing credits other than co-plotting a few stories. So anyway, he came to me, and I said, sure, I'll do it. Oh, you need it by Monday? I'll do it by Monday. So between that Wednesday or Thursday when Jim showed up at my office doorstep and the following Monday, I came up with the remaining 24 names. I wrote up all these profiles. That's an example of one of the profiles that I wrote. That one's for Optimus Prime. So like I said, Optimus Prime is a name that I inherited from the previous writer, but I came up with the actual story behind Optimus Prime, who he is, what his powers are, what his weaponry is. I gave him a motto. It's hard to read in the light here, but it's all there on that yellow legal pad paper. Next. And then I came up with another one. Oh, that one's Megatron. So that's a name that I did come up with. So again, this was how I turned everything in. And I wasn't much of a typist, and interestingly enough, there's a woman who worked in our licensing department who was an assistant to like one of the more executive people in the licensing department. And so Jim Shooter said, okay, if you need these typed up, give it to her. And she's here this weekend. She worked at Marvel, and she's here with her husband at one of the tables in the Artist Alley. And I reminded her of that. She completely forgot that she had to do all this typing for me, but she had to type up these bios so that we could turn them into Hasbro. So this is Megatron. So interesting story about the name Megatron. So obviously these are Hasbro's properties. They have complete authority over whether to accept or reject this stuff. So they initially rejected the name Megatron. And I understood going in that they could do whatever they wanted to, but I really liked the name Megatron. I thought it had a nice ring to it. And so even though I was the new guy on the block, I said, well, when they rejected it, I said, why don't you like the name Megatron? And they said, it sounds too scary. And I said, well, he's the head bad guy. He's supposed to sound scary. Oh, we hadn't thought of that. Yeah, okay, we'll go with Megatron. So I saved Megatron. Next. And this is formerly Ulktar, and this is Starscream. So, that's another name I devised. Next. And this is Ratchet. Next. But anyway, you get the idea. This was my style. I take out my yellow legal pad, come up with these names. This one is Stalker. Stalker did not manage to pass through Hasbro's legal department. All these names had to be checked by Hasbro Legal to make sure they had authority to put it out there as a toy without getting sued by somebody. So for whatever reasons, they didn't like Stalker. So that one became Ravage, which actually is a better name. Next. Yes?
They did actually come up with a Stalker later on. In Europe, there was a Transformer named Stalker.
Ah, well, maybe the copyright didn't extend to Europe or something for that, whatever character was Stalker. For all I knew, maybe G.I. Joe already had Stalker and I was unaware of it, and they didn't want to use it, so. But anyway, it became Ravage. Next. So we're at Fireball. Fireball, I think, became Jetfire. Yeah. Next. Bumblebee. Bumblebee replaced a character named Goldbug. So Goldbug was rejected for whatever reasons, and I came up with Bumblebee. I don't know whatever happened to that character, but I think he's been around. So anyway, so Bumblebee. Next. So anyway, then I took all these bios and I was asked to summarize them so they can go on the back of the toy packages. So what you see on the back of the toy packages are summaries of the longer bios that I wrote. So there's an example of Bumblebee and him being summarized. Well, then below that is the tech specs, yeah. So I believe I came up with the idea for the tech specs. At that time, Marvel was putting out these books called the Marvel Universe, which was basically an encyclopedia of all the Marvel characters. And Mark Grunwald, who was the editor behind the Marvel Universe, decided to rank the characters by different attributes. So strength, speed, stamina, intelligence, whatever. So I just pretty much took his system and adapted that to the Transformers, and I suggested to Hasbro, why don't you give them all specs so you could compare, the kids could compare them, see who's stronger, who's faster, et cetera. They liked that idea. They took it one step further. They made it so that it was unintelligible to anybody looking at the packaging. You might remember you had to use a piece of red cellophane to actually see the tech spec for that particular character. That was not my idea. I was not trying to torture anybody by forcing them to look through red cellophane to figure this stuff out. But I did come up with all the tech specs. Next. And I made a chart. So those are the initial 26 characters. And I figured it out. I wanted to make sure that it made sense so that, like, Optimus Prime would be stronger than Bumblebee, or, Jetfire would be faster than, Ironhide or whatever. So I charted everything so I can make it real clear to myself, and I submitted this to Hasbro, and they were thrilled with it. They loved it. Next. And they loved it so much they did it better. They made it clearer. It's the same numbers, but they made it clearer. And now you could read it in this light. You could see all the characters' names. A couple of them are still being changed. You could see the Blowout was changed to Cliff Jumper, and Sprint was changed to Wind Walk. I don't know, what does that say? Wind Charger. Yeah, so some of these names are still in flux. And further down, you see the first batch up to Optimus Prime are the Autobots, and then the last 8 or 10 or whatever are the Decepticons. And that's the entire tech specs for the first line of Transformers that came out. Next.
Can we just move this back a little bit here?
Oh, still talking too closely?
Yeah.
Okay.
You should be good right there.
Okay.
You can hear them, right?
We'll find out. Okay, next. And that's just an example of Generation 1, Optimus Prime box. Next. And on the back, there's the little summary of the bios that I was writing, as well as the tech specs hidden within that red graph there. Next. Okay, so then, as you probably remember, Transformers became a very successful toy very quickly. And so Hasbro would come out with new lines of toys every 6 months or a year, and they would send me a list of, if you see at the very top, it says product listing. So that's the, or I think it says product or project. What does it say?
Product.
Product, yeah. So those are the new products that were coming out for 1985 or whatever it was. And so you see there's a mini car assortment and a Constructicon assortment and so on and so forth. And all they would give me were, at this point, they were running out of the Japanese toys that they were rebranding. So eventually they started giving me model sheets of what their toy designs were going to look like. And so then I would look at those toy designs, whether it was a toy itself or whether it was a model sheet. I'd come up with the names. I'd come up with more bios. And you can see some of the names are already assigned to some of those characters.
What did they give you before the model sheets?
The actual toys, because before they had a backlog of Japanese toys from Takara and Bandai, and eventually they ran ahead of what those toy companies were producing. They had to come up with new designs.
And where are these toys now?
My own personal toys? Can I trust these people? I mean, they might break into my house.
Don't give them your address, but I'm just saying you still have these.
I still have them, some of them, yeah. I still have some of the original toys that they, and I didn't play with them.
I clone.
I didn't play with them, so they're still in their boxes. So.
Yeah, you're sitting on a fortune.
Oh, maybe, yeah. Okay.
Next.
Okay. If any of them get stolen, you're all suspects. Okay. So again, more listings of upcoming toy lines that I had to come up with names. You can see the Dinobot assortment there, which is, I came up with Grimlock, Slag, Sludge, Snarl, Swoop. So it was a lot of fun coming up with these names. It was a challenge, but it was a fun challenge. Next.
What was Grimlock's original name that you came up with?
I think it was always Grimlock. I think.
It was Jaw something?
Oh, it might have been Jawbreaker or something like that. Or something like that, yeah. I wanted to do something, he had this big jaw. I wanted to, actually it was partially inspired by, there's a Fantastic Four character called Lockjaw, who's a teleportational dog. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And so Lockjaw was this very friendly dog that was like 6 feet tall and had this massive jaw. And so that kind of inspired the name of Grimlock, the idea of these locking jaws.
Okay, next.
Next. And more of that. Okay, next. And so these are the kind of model sheets that I was given. So I got stacks and stacks of these things. These were coming out, right from whoever Hasbro had back in Japan or wherever, coming up with new designs for new toys. Next. And then it showed me the various versions of the toy, from how it transformed from one creature to another creature to a more humanoid robotic form. Next. And that became Nautil later. Next. And that shows them all together with the summary that went on the box and the tech specs. Next. And snakeskin, another example of the model sheets that they would send me. Next.
But he became Iguanus.
Oh, okay. He knows better than me. Yeah, I mean, I generated these names so many years ago, and people ask me, how'd you come up with that name or this name? It's like, oh, I did it 35 years ago, 40 years ago. It's hard to remember all these things. Next. And finally, Transformers #1. So I became the editor. So Marvel already planned to put out a 4-issue miniseries. Marvel, which makes sense. They were prudent. They didn't have any faith that any of these books based on toys would have any life to them. You never know when you put out a new toy, when a company puts out a new toy, if it's going to be successful or not. And if you base a comic book on the toy, usually the comic book is only as successful as the toy. Not always. A couple of 1980s era Marvel toy books actually outlasted the toy by quite a bit. So anyway, Marvel planned a 4-issue miniseries. I was the obvious choice to be the editor of the miniseries. So there's issue #1. Next. And then, lo and behold, issue #5, which we did not plan originally. Originally, we were going to end it with issue 4. We had an ending that was already drawn and inked and lettered. Wrapped up the whole storyline. But at some point, as we were getting close to to putting out issue 4, it became obvious that this was going to be a big hit comic book. The sales were really good, so we continued with issue 5. We redrew the last page or two, so it ended on a cliffhanger that led into this. So with issue 5, I became the writer of the book. I was no longer the editor.
And I believe that in the UK, because they got it ahead of time, they actually had the original.
That's true, yes. I had completely forgotten about the fact that there was an actual ending to the miniseries that we jettisoned. Until a few years ago, somebody showed me the reprint from the UK. So the UK did not get the change that we made. So on their reprint, they show the actual ending that we originally intended, which is, Decepticons lose, Autobots win, there's peace in the universe. But we threw that out for the American market. Next. Okay, and then as years went on, Hasbro kept expanding the Transformers in different directions and adding new subgroups of Transformers, et cetera. So I had to really expand on the mythology of it. So I would come up with, actually, I'm not. This is wrong. I'm jumping ahead. This is right, but what I'm saying is incorrect. This is just a plot. Okay. So this is how I would do a plot for a story. Like I said, I started taking over the book with issue 5 as a writer, and you basically write like a short story, and you describe what happens to so the artist can draw it. Next. And that became this issue, Into the Smelting Pool, which is my favorite story that I wrote. It's also the first time I introduced Cybertron into the comic book. Next. And then I realized as time went on, I really got to give the artist a break as much as possible. So I would list all the characters up front that the artist would have to refer to for that particular story, so the artist could pull the reference. But the artist, those same model sheets I was showing you, the artist had his own stack. And so I try to prepare him for what was to come next. And that became this issue, which was a Decepticon graffiti. And what's special about this issue is that as all the Transformers stories, they would attract fan letters. And this got a fan letter from a very special fan. Stan Lee wrote a fan letter about this issue. He sent a letter saying, I just read this issue and it's great, and whatever he said. And we were thrilled, myself and the editorial office, we were thrilled that Stan actually paid attention to this book and read it and took the time to write a really nice letter saying how much he liked it. So we featured that letter a couple of issues later in the fan letter column. Next. And this shows you how covers were drawn. So originally, before you see a finished cover, the editor wants to see a sketch. You know, what's the idea behind the cover? What's going to sell this book? And sometimes the editor could scribble like some stick figures if they didn't know how to draw, or he would go to the art director, and the art director would come up with a sketch that the editor and the art director would agree on. Well, it so happened that the writer of the Transformers, me, knew how to draw. So most of the covers, even though I didn't draw them, I designed them. So this is a cover, that's the cover sketch. So that would take me about maybe 5 minutes or less to sketch that out. And once the editor said, yeah, let's go with that, next. There's the cover. That's the cover I actually drew. The reason I wanted to draw that particular cover is because I wanted to make it clear to the artist of the interior of the book what these scraplets looked like. You know, I could describe them in words, but you know, picture's worth 1,000 words. So I said, let me draw the cover. He'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And so I drew the cover myself. Next. And again, this is another example of a cover sketch. Next. And this one was drawn by Frank Springer, who was, I think, the artist of the book at that time. So that's what that turned into. Next. And again, one more cover sketch, and next. And this one I drew myself as well. So little side note, this is obviously taking place in what looks like the Grand Canyon. I had just visited the Grand Canyon. So you know, if I go places, I would try to, you know, you write what you know. So I place this in the Grand Canyon. I also learned a valuable lesson from watching a valuable lesson about taxes from watching Saturday Night Live. So back in the 80s, there was a sketch. It's more like a monologue by one of their writers, Al Franken, who became a senator. And he showed postcards from his trip to Hawaii, from his vacation to Hawaii. And he stood in front of the microphone. He got laughs. He says, I'm a comedian. I'm showing you a postcard about my trip. You're laughing. I'm doing my job. Tax deduction. So what he was saying was, by incorporating his trip to Hawaii as part of his comedy routine, his trip became a tax deduction. So I incorporated my trip to the Grand Canyon. So I showed it to my accountant, showed the comic book to him, tax deduction. Next. Yeah, so keep that in mind. Again, another cover sketch I did, and that's turned into another cover that I drew. So I drew that cover. By the way, these covers are available on my table for purchase if you want, the poster prints of them.
And
Next.
wasn't this your trip to the Caribbean?
Probably, yeah.
That was
I think
tax-deductible?
I think it was based on a trip to the Caribbean. Yes, I believe so. Yes, and there was a creature like that I had to swim away from. Next. Okay, so all of these bios were accumulated into this first a 4-issue series of like 32 bios per comic book, and then they were all packaged together in this Marvel Universe book, which somebody told me on Friday is worth a lot of money these days. You know, it's like somebody saying, oh, you can, you know, it's like $250 on eBay. I don't know. I got my own copy. I'm not looking.
I have the 4 separate issues, so
Yeah.
I used it in a video. But next.
Next. Okay, so here's what I was getting at. So as things developed and new pieces of the Transformers mythology was added through the toys, like the Pretenders and the I don't know, the Headmasters and so on, I had to come up with more backstory. So this is something to do with that. Next, that's Headmasters, which, you know, that became a treatment, and I turned it into Hasbro, and Hasbro would approve it, and then Headmasters became its own miniseries. Next. And there's the first issue cover of the Headmasters, which actually I drew that cover as well. Next. And then I would come up with some concepts like the Creation Matrix, which became the Allspark, I think, in the animated series.
Well, Matrix of Leadership first, and then they kind of created the Allspark.
Okay, yeah. I never watched it. I never watched the series, so I don't know. But anyway, I came up with these concepts. So again, Hasbro would ask me to put it together, because they would share all this stuff that I'm showing you, all these bios and names and the backstory, all went to Hasbro, and then Hasbro shared it with Sunbow Productions. Sunbow was behind the animated series and the animated movie, and then they would do whatever they do with it. But they would want it in writing so that they could share it with other people. Next.
Oh, come on. touchpads.
No, I think we're almost at the end, too. Okay,
Last one.
and the end. So just a great splash page by the late Herb Trimpe of the creation matrix stuck in Buster Witwicky's head at the moment. And so he's using all of his newfound power to make all this machinery float around in the air. And that's it. And so I stayed on as the writer of the Transformers from issue 5 through issue 55. There were a couple of fill-ins in between. And it was a wonderful run. I had a great time working with it, working on the Transformers. It was great working with Hasbro. And what was especially nice about working on the Transformers while working at Marvel is that I didn't have to worry about 20 years or 30 years of Marvel continuity. I could do pretty much whatever I wanted, up to a point. In the book, I didn't have to worry about, well, what happened in 1967 versus the Absorbing Man or some other Marvel super villain or something. So it gave me a big sandbox to play in, and so it was a lot of fun. And that's my presentation. That's a lot better than me just talking without the pictures. And so I am here now to take any questions you might have.
Again, please use the microphone over there. I have a question, Bob.
Yes.
So originally, I guess the plan was to incorporate the Transformers into the Marvel Universe because we did have the black-suited Spider-Man in issue 3. And
Well,
then they decided not to?
Okay, so actually there are 2 or 3 interfaces with the Marvel Universe in the Transformers books that I was involved with. And the black Spider-Man costume was one of them. So no, there wasn't really any plan. It wasn't planned to incorporate them or not to incorporate them. And in retrospect, it would have been better to not incorporate the Transformers at all in the Marvel Universe. Because it complicates matters down the line. We weren't looking down the line, but once the Transformers was no longer a Marvel license, anytime somebody wants to, anytime somebody wants to use the Transformers, they have to get permission from Marvel, and they might not get permission to reprint those issues that featured Marvel characters. So issue 3 featured Spider-Man as a guest star, and how that happened was the writer at that time was Jim Salicrup, who's also here. It's like everybody that I've mentioned in this presentation is actually here today. Jim Salicrup is here, and he was a Spider-Man editor at the time, and he was also writing that book for me. So he said, I have a great idea. We'll take this unknown toy and we'll put Marvel's most prominent character in there as a guest star, which is quite common back then, that you'd feature a guest star in a new book to try to attract attention to it and pull in some new audience. So he wanted to feature Spider-Man. I said, sure, And he was the editor of Spider-Man, so I didn't have to go to the editor to get permission to use their character, as I normally would, because he was the editor. So it's a nice, cut and dry deal. So we told Hasbro, and Hasbro rejected the idea, and which was kind of astounding to us. Like, we're giving you our franchise character for your unknown toy comic book, and you don't want him? The reason was, at the time, Marvel had a license, I believe with Mattel, for action figures, and Spider-Man being one of them. And from the Hasbro toy company point of view, if we did that, if we featured Spider-Man in the Transformers, we would be helping to promote their rival toy company. They would sell supposedly more Spider-Man action figures somehow by featuring Spider-Man in a Transformers comic. So that was their choice. But then Jim came up with another idea. He said, well, we just recently introduced the Spider-Man black costume. They don't have the license to the black costume. They only have the license to the red and blue costume for an action figure. What if we put him in the black costume? So I ran that idea by Hasbro, and he said, oh, okay, that's all right. Nobody will know it's Spider-Man. So anyway, that's how Spider-Man got featured in the book. There were 2 other places in that run that I did where there was a crossover with Marvel. So I had to come up with, after the initial arc crashing onto Earth, which had like a self-contained group of Transformers, Autobots, and Decepticons, and then Hasbro kept adding new lines of toys. I had to come up with new ways to introduce more toys into the storyline, more characters based on the new toys. So I did something with the Dinobots, and I based their origin somehow in the Savage Land, which is a Marvel concept. So there was some Savage Land crossover. No characters, but just the concept of the Savage Land. But in the Marvel universe, the Savage Land is like this prehistoric land that includes dinosaurs. The third place where there was a crossover is I created a character called Circuit Breaker, And anytime a character appeared in a Hasbro licensed book, like Transformers, they owned it, unless it was pre-existing somewhere else. So I made sure that Circuit Breaker, I thought she was a potentially interesting character I might want to use somewhere else. I made sure she was a Marvel property, so we introduced her in one panel of Secret Wars before she was featured in Transformers. So Marvel owned the copyright, not Hasbro. So little sneaky things we did. Thank you. Okay, thank you. So anyway, next, any other questions? I think they want you at the mic, so we can record all this for posterity.
So, real quick question. Okay, it's on. Real quick question. So I know you said like some of the names that got changed as you went, but I do remember like some of those names ended up getting used in like the cartoon, like eventually. Did you have any say in any of that? Because I know like Bumblebee eventually got reformatted as Goldbug, and the human in the cartoon was Spike instead of Buster. So
Yeah, I'm guessing Spike was in the cartoon because they didn't get my scribbled changes. They probably got an earlier version of that draft, and they probably never saw Spike in there.
yeah, because I know Bumblebee like eventually got like damaged in the final season. They reformatted him as Goldbug, so I wasn't sure if you had any say in any of that.
I had nothing to do with the animated series. I never watched it, so whatever they did, they did, and I can't really comment on it because I was not involved with it. But yeah, I've heard over the years that other characters that were scratched at one point or were just featured, like there was a character I created for that issue I showed you, the Into the Smelting Pool. I was told it became a toy eventually, years later. Straxus. There was a bad guy in there. Somebody told me he became a toy like a couple of decades later. Yeah, he's shaking his head, yeah. So, I don't know. I mean, they can do what they want. It's okay with me.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay.
They don't have to ask my permission. I don't own this stuff. Next. Yes. Okay. Go next.
Well, you said you drew a lot of your experiences writing comics from things that you did. Can you give like some other examples of things that you happened to do that you incorporated into the comics?
Oh, it's a big question. I was telling you about the Ironhide story yesterday. Was that it? Well, I'll tell it again. So anyway, I had to come up with all, people have asked me over the years, how do you come up with all these names and where, how does anybody come up with anything? It's based on your own personal experiences. So I watched TV, I saw movies, I read books, I read the newspaper. I did crossword puzzles, so I had a pretty good facility with words. So like an example is Ironhide. That came from, there was a TV show on NBC in the late 60s called Ironsides. And it was about a police detective who was crippled and was confined to a wheelchair. So I thought Ironsides, Ironhide, that sounds pretty cool, It's a good sounding name. I was given 3 in that initial line of toys. I was given 3 Decepticons that were identical, except for they were painted differently. They were 3 jet fighters. So I just figured out, okay, I'm going to come up with a name for each one that has something to do with the heavens, the sky above, and something that's discomforting in some way, So I came up with Skywarp, Thundercracker, and Starscream. And all 3 of those combine exactly what I just said. Sky, thunder, and star are all about the heavens to some degree. And then Scream, Warp, and Cracker, especially Thundercracker in that combination, are all a little bit discomforting. So I just put words together, was inspired by what the actual toys did, what they looked like and whether they were some kind of creature or not, and came up with stuff. Yeah, so I mean, if you asked me, what about this character, I might remember what inspired it, but there's so many, I don't want to stay here all day going down the list, but anyway, next. Yes.
So I had a bit of a question more on your writing process.
Okay.
So you mentioned that you had the original storyline put it to you, and then you had all the characters that you had to develop. How did you maintain a smooth transition between each character's story and then the later on development of the mythology itself?
Well, that's a well-worded question about the smooth transition, I think yeah, that wasn't easy because, like Transformers started out with 26 characters, and then every few months, Hasbro would introduce a whole new batch of characters. And, from a reader's point of view, you're just reading the story, but from my point of view, I know that the purpose of this comic book is to sell toys. So I had to figure out new ways every few months to introduce a whole new batch of characters and kind of move aside a lot of the characters that I'd been working with, that I'd been developing. So it may have seemed smooth, but it was very difficult after a while because it was, okay, here's another 10 characters, 12 characters, 15 characters. I have to figure out how to get them into the storyline. Everything was, so I came up with different ways. So like for instance, that smelting pool storyline introduced the Bridge to Nowhere, which was a space bridge. So that allowed some new characters from Cybertron to move over to Earth. I don't know, I'd have to, go through and figure out, but there's so many, I mentioned, I used the Savage Land as a template for the Dinobots. So whatever was put on my plate, okay, here's a new batch of characters, how do I fit them in? I'd have to figure something out. And frankly, eventually, it became exhausting because, it's one thing to write one, like Spider-Man, Peter Parker Spider-Man, every month for year and year and year, and you got that one character to develop. But when you have this cast of characters and they keep changing and you keep having to jettison characters that you've been playing with, that you like, that you don't have any room for anymore, as a writer, I found it exhausting. And eventually, I was begging to be replaced as the writer on that book because I had enough. I just, needed to move to something that was a little less taxing on my imagination of how to introduce all these new characters. So, there you go.
Well, you did great.
Thank you. Yes. Any other questions?
Can I ask some questions?
Sure.
I don't know, did you talk about the Underbase saga? That's like my favorite storyline.
Oh, no, we did not.
So where did the concept of Starscream being like so conniving and scheming to become so powerful? I know part of that was getting rid of some characters, but...
Right. Well, Starscream, I always designed Starscream as like the second in command who really coveted power. So, and that's not, that's a, that's nothing new. That's like a classic sort of a meme, basically, like if you know Fantastic Four comic books from the 1960s, some of you are too young perhaps, the Inhumans was introduced. So the Inhumans had Black Bolt, but he also had a brother named Maximus who was really power hungry. And whereas Black Bolt was considered a fairly noble and well-meaning character, Maximus would do whatever it took to get to where he wanted to go. And you could find that kind of dynamic in fiction, over and over again. So I just set it up like, you had Megatron, as evil as he was, knew how to like keep control and keep command of his troops pretty much. Whereas Starscream, even his name kind of suggests he kind of went over the top. He pushed the envelope too far, and that's what the Underbase saga built up to. That he pushed it too far. He was even warned at some point, or maybe Optimus was warned when he was a younger Optimus. Like, don't touch this Underbase. It's going to be more than you can handle. And sure enough, Starscream gets it. He succeeds, and he just basically explodes because he has too much power. So anyway, I wanted to build up to issue 50 with a big storyline, and create all this tension between Starscream, Megatron, plus versus the Autobots. I think the Autobots were falling into different factions at that time to some extent, and I also wanted to include a name from a real good friend of mine. So I think the Underbase was in a mountain of data called Boltax, yeah. So a good friend of mine is named Janet Boltax. So I wanted to include her name. I thought her name was perfect for a Transformers kind of a name, Boltax. And so I used that in the underbase. And weirdly enough, just a couple weeks ago, I was on my Facebook thread and somebody had a link to some old DC comic from the 1970s. I think it was Superboy. And there was like a Lord Boltax in it. And I had no idea. my Boltax didn't come for like another 10 or 12 years. So I actually took that link and I sent it to my friend Janet. I said, you know, he's been in comics more than once. And she was surprised too. So anyway, that was the origin of the underbase.
So speaking of names, I don't know if you mentioned this. Where did you get the name for the kid who actually pressed the button and killed Optimus Prime?
Oh, Ethan Zachary? Mm-hmm. Oh, that one was easy. So my brother, Gary, lives up right north of here in Massachusetts. So he has 4 children. They're all grown-ups now. So his second youngest is Ethan Zachary Budiansky. So I just took his name. He was probably, I'm trying to think, he was probably about 10 or 11 years old at the time. So he still likes to brag that he killed Optimus Prime. Yeah.
But he did save his mind on a
Yes.
5 1/4-inch floppy disk.
That's
the
true.
compression must have been awesome.
Yeah. The technology was better than you thought back then. Yes. I was trying to keep up with the latest technology. You know, I might have stretched it a little bit.
Just a tad.
A little bit, yeah. Anything else? Last chance. We're good?
Car Wash of Doom. Do we want to talk about the Car Wash of Doom?
If you like, I'll talk about whatever you until Penny kicks me out. I'll talk about whatever you want. It's up to her.
So where did you get the concept for the Car Wash of Doom? That
was easy. I mean, that's pretty obvious. You know, well, first of all, more generally, I was really interested, when I was writing the Transformers, I was really interested in taking very human situations and putting the Transformers in those situations. So you had situations where there was a rock concert, there was a ski slope, there was a Caribbean island, there was a used car lot. You know, I wanted to take these in very familiar situations that people can relate to, hopefully, my readers can relate to, and see how the Transformers reacted in those situations. So I devised a story, and admittedly, it was somewhat of a parody of Transformers, somewhat comical. It would probably fit in very well as a Guardians of the Galaxy story these days. I guess it was a little controversial back then, perhaps, for some fans. But it was just taken from, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. We even copied the font that was used in the movie poster to put it into the title of that story. And I just copied the basic idea that there was a car wash of doom. If you entered this car wash, you wouldn't come out the same, just like the Temple of Doom. So that was it. Pretty. Like I said earlier, like I drew from my own experiences, movies, TV, whatever, and there was an example, a real good example. And going back to, I mentioned the Smelting Pool story, which was my favorite story that I wrote to me anyway. The ending of that, I don't know how well all of you know that story, but in the ending, Blaster has this sidekick who's kind of like this. He's called Scrounge, and he's kind of this little weak guy, but he's out there doing the legwork and being like his spy and trying to gather an important piece of information. And basically, Scrounge sacrifices his life at the very end of the story to get that piece of information to Blaster so he could bring it to the other Autobots on Cybertron that he's working with. And I think it was like the plans to the bridge, the space bridge. I think that's what was in that piece of information. Well, anyway, that ending, if any of you have ever seen the movie from the 1930s starring Cary Grant called Gunga Din, watch the ending. It's very similar. Okay, so a Rudyard Kipling story. And, so again, I'm very influenced by what I saw, what I watched, what I read, and whether I stole it or paid homage or just use some of the ideas. But that's how a lot of things get into my stories that I write. Anything else?
Well, I'm curious. The names you came up with names of Transformers that Hasbro didn't put out. Like I'm trying to remember the name of the main villain in the smelting pool was the Decepticon leader. Straxus.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I think you might have been out of the room. I talked about him, but that Hasbro eventually put out a toy based on Straxus.
You get any money for that? Coming up with that name and then they make a toy out of it,
The Dark Mount. Oh,
Isn't Dark Mount another thing? Because that was a Decepticon stronghold.
it might have been. Did I have that in the story? I forgot.
Yeah. Wiki is a wonderful thing.
Well, when you're doing a licensed book for Marvel, you don't own anything. It's their property. I'm just being paid to write a story. So whatever they do with it, they do with it. Not much I can do at this late date. I look at it this way. I mean, I did get paid, and by the standards of the time, I got paid, decently, pretty well. But if I said, I'm not going to do this unless, you give me a percentage of all future revenues based on this or that, they would have said, thank you, we'll find somebody else. That's all. That's just the way it works.
Very different world today, but.
Yeah, so. Anything else?
All right.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed the show.
Give Bob a great round of applause. The father of Transformers.
Well,
Stepfather?
I think I did one panel years ago, and the people running the panel said, come up with a name for the panel. And I said, they wanted something funny. I said, I am Megatron's father. That was my name for the panel. I wouldn't say I'm the father of the Transformers. I don't go that far, but I did name Megatron.
Without you, there would be no Megatron, so.
Yeah, he'd be big bad guy or something, Whatever. All right, thank you again for coming.
Hey fans, just reminding you that 80stees.com sponsored this deep dive into Transformers history. And they have the retro shirts you'll need to transform and roll out. Use coupon code FSTransform to get 30% off your next order over at 80stees.com. Till all are one.
Thank you for watching this video. I am Invader Zim, and I traffic in doom. And so, if you do not subscribe to this channel, you will have doom that befalls you by me, Invader Zim.